Hi, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of Yale African Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's event featuring the renowned artist Adejoke Tugbiyele. We're going to start by, I'll introduce her, and then we'll hear from her for probably about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So, but before we go ahead with the event, I want everyone to know that you can please drop questions in the chat throughout the entire event. You don't have to save them for the end. Feel free, if something comes to mind, just pop it right into the chat and then we'll address it in the Q&A portion. So, born in New York, raised in Lagos, Nigeria, Aderonke Tugbiyele explores the concept of transformation towards transcending identity while simultaneously queering dominant space. Her multidisciplinary practice explores hybridity. It is highly inventive, innovative, and monumental in detail and scale. She draws inspiration from Yoruba spirituality, cosmology, as it flows with universal links that also seek to bridge and weave African, African American, and diaspora concerns. Tugbiyele is a multi-award winning artist, and her works have been mentioned and reviewed in many leading publications, including Sculpture Magazine, the New York Times, Hyperallergic Magazine, Art Africa Magazine, The Soul Adventurer, Design Miami Blog, Quotidien de l'Art, and Jeune Afrique. She is regularly invited to contribute as a panelist in dialogues hosted by reputable institutions around the world. After 2 decades studying and practicing architecture, Tugbiyele received a Master of Fine Arts in Sculpture from Maryland Institute College of Art in 2013. Her works grace important corporate, public, and private collections, including the Brooklyn Museum, the Museum of Arts and Design, the National Museum of African Art, Smithsonian, the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, the Newark Museum, Institut Français in Burkina Faso, Daimler Art Collection in Berlin, and Credit Suisse Bank at Swiss Bank Global. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Adejoke, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I would like to start with slide number 3. Within the book, Yoruba Sacred Kingship, Power Like That of the Gods, Pemberton and Afolayan state that woman's power is the mysterious hidden power of birth. It is referred to as the Ashe energy of our mothers. It is the hidden covert power. In Yoruba ritual art, woman's power is thus imaged by the bird. Crown for Kamala is rooted sensibly in this traditional Yoruba aesthetic. It is a performance in collaboration with dancer Lindsay Bauer, who herself identifies as queer and lesbian artist. She brings to life the costume made of palm spines, the crown, and the cape made of adire and gele, lace. The performance, while rooted in traditional Yoruba aesthetics, is actually a contemporary revisioning of that work as the masked dance, or what we call egungun. Egungun masquerade has been widely discussed by scholars such as Bolaji Campbell in his book Fabric of Immortality, Ancestral Power, Performance and Agency, as well as scholars like Robert Farris Thompson. I invite you to read his 1974 book, African Art in Motion, which expresses African art as an art of dance and performance in spirit primarily. The crown is heavy, both literally and metaphorically. The crown comes with a responsibility to serve, to teach, to honor and give back to community. It's been a reoccurring concept in my body of work. I'm harking to the royal place that the Oba's crown, the king's crown, sits in Yoruba canon. I draw inspiration from this while I also queer the traditional space. However, I was also inspired with this work by the nomination and eventual election of Kamala Harris as the first woman vice president in the history of the United States. Not her being as a person per se, however, what her position symbolizing that structures reserved for white men are further interrogated, and the continued exploration of power of femininity in a preconceived masculine role. In this performance, sculpture, textiles, movement, sound, light, and environment all come together harmoniously. The sound that you hear, the song, is called Hawa Dolo, which I believe means from the source. It's played by Master Kora player Ali Fakature, Malian player, from the album In the Heart of the Moon. And a lot of the sounds seem to hark to water, nature, and the movement that you see that's elevated in Bauer's performance. I was inspired by William Kentridge's 2020 video entitled Sybil. And here I'll ask Ali to move to the first slide. In this video, there's a certain spirit-filled dynamic that I witnessed in the effects, in the movement, the layering of images. There's an accelerated speed of movement over a very somber, melancholic, and dramatic sound. It created a pleasant discomfort in my mind, one that suggests the ongoing need for reconciliation around issues of identity, towards redemption, transformation. So poetically speaking, with Crown for Kamala, there's a sense of moving out of the dark and into the light. And I try to bring forth this sensibility. Bauer's movement is also informed by contemporary dance. She's trained in both capoeira as well as the Alvin Ailey School of Thought. And for inspiration, I spent many hours watching the performance entitled Chroma by Wayne McGregor. This was performed at Lincoln Center and many other places, I suppose, by the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater, Alvin Ailey Dance Company. Here, there are some layered dual movements that I began to bring into the video, the editing of the video, specifically for Crown for Kamala. I ensure that Bauer's movement is doubled to suggest or imply an identical or twin dance partner, further heightening the frequency of the movement and elevating the vibration and the flow of the cloth, which is the cape made of lace gele, thankfully passed down to me from my mother, Abimbola Tugbiyele. Next slide. Crown for Kamala, I would say, is a very different approach to feminism than, say, Martha Rosler's video, Semiotics of the Kitchen, where ordinary utensils are presented as potential weapons. I love that video. However, with this sense of queer feminism, I'm bringing in a more spiritual sensibility, and again, one that's rooted in Yoruba performance, which we call, once again, egungun. Next slide. The crown, as I said, has popped up in my practice in many different mediums, performance, but also sculpture. Here we see the work couronne, which means crown in French. It was produced in the ancient lost wax technique in the Bronze Studio in collaboration with Issouf Derme Atelier in Burkina Faso. It pushes my work towards greater realism, as seen in some classical Benin sculptures. And the works are also timely as we think about ongoing debates around restitution of looted bronzes by former European colonial powers in Africa. While this work was produced in Burkina Faso and not in Nigeria, which is my familiar and ancestral land, and where the lost wax technique continues to thrive at a place called Ife, it was quite significant that I could produce this work as an openly queer woman within a role and a tradition that is reserved usually for men in this West African context. That acceptance and love could occur at this level within West Africa shows promise in the discourse around queer liberation as well as women's equality. So the discussion of restitution on Benin bronzes, therefore, need not end at the collection of objects for its own sake, but simultaneously result in further transformation of the mind, the psyche, deep respect for individuality, tolerance, creative energy, and acceptance of the sacred nature and essence of every human being, regardless of identity. If restitution is about reclamation, it's also about permission. I asked questions such as giving ourselves permission. Can we give ourselves permission to love unconditionally while bearing witness to our individual crowns? Next slide. The road to divinity pushes my work towards greater realism. I form a continuous double helix loop with wire, a gesture that occurs in some earlier sculptures. But here, what we see are some clear body parts formed and other organic shapes. I purposely leave the legs loose. There are some parts of nature and plants and trees that I feel are inspired of this work. But there's also something in the gesture that might suggest that it's a presence that's unfinished, a purpose and intention that we are still working towards, in other words. It invites my audience to consider some new questions. What exactly is our intention? Whose intention is it? And to what ends? For what results? Next slide. This idea of the double helix and looping it begins in some sculptures such as Afrikia, where the double helix involves lines of twine used to transform these legs of a repurposed IKEA stool into the backrest of a throne. I revisit this process with wire in The Road to Divinity, allowing the palm spines to speak freely, providing structure and guidance. Next slide. I provide structure and guidance with the wire as a membrane, which serves as a substructure. So the overall shape is partly opaque and partly transparent. This is prior to then coloring it indigo, which I will get to later on in the presentation. Next slide. My work begins to go deep beneath the surface, but I believe that this is foreshadowed in some earlier works, such as Proof and Past Future, as shown here. Proof appears somewhere in between human and hybrid, growing perhaps out of the indigenous realm, a sort of hyperdevelopment with some futuristic implications. It suggests a dance. It sort of towers over the human. It's taller than average height. And Past Future has woven elements that are on the surface. I blend this aesthetic with other materials like metal and wire, and some repurposed items, such as the hat that you see there. But in contrast to Proof, which is standing tall, as you can see, Past Future is a figure bent over. And through this, I'm inviting the audience, I'm inviting you to consider multiple narratives around dominant and submissive play, whether they be in work, play, or other quote unquote bottom activity. Next slide. Flight to Revelation, similarly, you have wire and metal that give skeletal shape to the form. My work attempts to engage audiences in a shift in perception, one that breaks with self-defeating notions of Africa, and in effect, these are remnants of colonial conditions and centuries of enslavement. So what I'm attempting to do is push towards a view of Africa with its own distinct authority, as had been for over 1,000 years, even more. And how that comes out in gestures of flight and prestige and freedom, I think is what I hark to in works like Flight to Revelation. Next slide. Flight to Revelation 2, produced 6 years later, carries similar intentions. Next slide. Again, one of my starting points was deeper investigation into gestures such as flight, standing, sitting, or even just simply being at rest, at leisure, marking one's sacred place, one's sacred territory, and thus having the ability and the privilege, actually, to make clear, informed decisions. I'm inspired by 13th and 14th century sculptures within the Yoruba canon, such as this one you see here called Tada from Ife. It is made of bronze and copper alloy and can be said to be in this idealized naturalism that thrived in the 13th and 14th century in Nigeria. Next slide. Recent works such as Purpose also borrow from this idea of the idealized naturalism, where you see a form that isn't necessarily identical to a certain particular human being, but is recognizably a figure. And what is that figure in its gesture speaking to, and what is that figure in its gesture saying? I draw inspiration from these many bronzes and copper figures in the Yoruba canon, which also informed my bronze works, and I will get to more detail about that later on. Next slide. In The Road to Divinity, I'm also borrowing from the ancient Eastern approach to pleasure, such as the Tantra, where sexuality and spirituality share the same realm. Our postmodern context supports the reverse logic. We have become far removed from sacred indigenous practice dating back millennia, and further, hypersexualized in this contemporary media environment, lending to the soulless nature of relationship. So here what we have are two androgynous figures engaged in the act of oral pleasure, appearing as floating divine spirits, where the line of sexuality and spirituality are blurred. I'm attempting to tease, enchant, and mesmerize the audience, both from a distance as well as at close range. Within the Yoruba canon, sexuality is actually very fluid traditionally, and it's embedded in our language. For instance, a Yoruba woman may refer to a close female friend as "Okomi," which translates as "my husband." Alternatively, she could refer to another woman as "Iyawomi," which translates as "my wife." And this is because the gender term has very little to do with the biological identity of the other person, but rather places emphasis on the nature of the relationship between two people, whether they be men or two women, depending on who assumes the dominant role versus a more submissive role. Next slide. As you could see, there's phallic imagery that appears in The Road to Divinity, and I'm borrowing from earlier works where I explore phallic imagery, such as this one that you see here called Unpray the Flesh. Similarly, the next slide, please. Sex Demons. Next slide. Light Beam. Next slide. Travel number 10. Travel number 10 presents as a diptych, an ink drawing, and a fabric relief work. Ink drawings in my work are spontaneous, organic, poetic movements, which draw inspiration from incredible markings that I found along the interior walls of the shrine at Oshun Sacred Grove. Next slide. I was blessed to tour the Sacred Grove, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, landmark for the preservation of indigenous Yoruba culture and heritage. At the shrine, I found little to no separation between art and architecture, but rather a continuous organic rhythm in form. Some structures included walls that have these highly detailed markings, lines, circles, and points, forming an immersive environment that lent to the sacred nature and the intentions of the shrine. However, I also owe my control of the pen to the ability to mark paper confidently to decades of traditional handwriting in architectural study prior to my engagement with art. In my drawings, you'll see a lot of architectonic elements, grids, points, and shapes. And I think that even within that, there's a spiritual element, the sacred geometry that comes out in those works. Next slide. I extended earlier investigations with traditional broom, the palm spines that you see earlier, and fabric into the indigenous practice of lost wax bronze production, adding to discourse within queer aesthetics on spirituality, hybridity, fluidity, but also duality of masculine and feminine forms. So here you see the return of phallic imagery as I am working and continuously trying to queer dominant space. Next slide. The production of son de la musique, which means sound of music, is a bronze sculpture produced again in Burkina Faso in collaboration with master artisans at Issou Derme Atelier. My lean towards bronze sculpture is foreshadowed in several earlier sculptures that employ metal, including Double Life Mask #2. Next slide. Here, the mask is performed as sculpture in the tradition of Egungun, once again, the mask dance, in a solo performance called Shifting the Waves, as part of a special project by 154 Contemporary African Art Fair and October Gallery in London. Each woven metal disc that you see on the mask involves the creation of a sacred geometric pattern, which has also been linked to divinity as well as transformation, both in Yoruba contexts and in Eastern contexts. Think of the mandala, for example. Next slide. As the phallus is often linked to manhood, quote unquote, my work tries to deconstruct the psyche, suggesting that masculine energy can also be achieved by women, not just men, and thus interrogating conservative notions of women as the quote unquote weaker sex. I draw from the canon, as I said earlier, in Crown for Kamala, whereby birds or winged figures express the hidden strength and the power of women, the power of our mothers. In this work, similarly, I explore the duality of light and dark. There are LEDs built into this costume. By doing so, I'm inviting my audience to consider some social conditions around sustainability in Africa, such as, for example, the lack of electricity. In Nigeria, it's called NEPA, and when NEPA takes the light. In South Africa, it's called load shedding, and I'm sure there are different terms for it in other parts of the world. But we come to think about the work more poetically, as I said earlier with Crown for Kamala, moving out of the light into the dark. But we can also think about in very practical and physical terms as how much more work do we have to do on the continent towards creating a better life for human beings. Next slide. And just another image of Crown for Kamala to remind you of what I was talking about regarding the flight and power of birds. Next slide. My sculpture practice has experienced several shifts with color over the past decade, moving from the use of bright colors, as you saw earlier, to a phase of black, and then later on, indigo. With black, I attempt to give voice to the strength and resilience of Black people, Africans, in the face of racism and colonialism over centuries. These works include Dignity, as seen here, My Queen's Throne, Drama, Global Sweep for a Goddess, Unholy Matrimony, 2, and Dark Angel's Plea. Formally speaking, the tradition of Yoruba assemblage, bringing disparate materials together, very different utilitarian objects, has been very inspiring to me. However, I've also been inspired by the works of other contemporaries and mentors who have guided my practice over decades, such as Ella Natsui and his technique of joining and linking metal parts together to create a hard fabric, a new type of cloth, or as Yoruba people say, ashoton soro, a new type of cloth that speaks. This aesthetic of combining repurposed traditional African brooms with metal engages my audience in a discourse around natural and industrial materials, the historic relationship between Africa and the West, perhaps. I'm also raising questions about consumption, similar to Ella Natsui's work, but also of commodity, not just the idea, not just what we actually physically consume, but also the ideas that we take into our minds, into our psyche. Dark Angel's plea have utilitarian objects within them, the metal parts that I described earlier, the woven metal shapes that similarly have this mandala or the sacred geometry woven through. They're all utilitarian objects made in China. Many other products globally consumed, as we know, come from this area. And we start to think about how not only am I think about how am I not only raising the currency of these materials, but how am I adding to discourse around the histories and even the contemporary issues that we are talking around between Africa and the West. I think about, for example, the rise of white supremacy and how, the increase in violence around Black and Asian people need to be addressed very critically, not just politically, but also within our contemporary art fields. And how does my work actually contribute to that as I attempt to hone my craft in the studio? Next slide. Once again, a work by Ella Natsui at the Museum of Art and Design. And here you see it alongside Heart and Crown. Similarly, performance works made with traditional African broom woven with metal. Palm stems, or what we say are Igbale in Yoruba, carry a social and political charge and a currency that are related to multiple uses over thousands of years, spiritually, industrially, and culturally, medicinally. I invite audiences to think about the global history of palm trees and palm oil, for example, which lubricated Europe's industrial revolution long before the discovery of oil, crude oil that is, in West Africa. I sometimes weave palm spines into my fabric works, as in this one, entitled My Hero Dad. Here you see my hero dad positioned along a photo of my father, who currently serves as acting president of Adejoke Community Development Association in New York. It's a charity organization that aims to advance the cultural heritage as well as develop physical infrastructure in Igbajo, Nigeria, our hometown, also known as Citadel of the Brave. I've positioned this image alongside my hero dad because I'm borrowing from the traditional agbada, the prestige dress, as my father's wearing in this image, the agbada, and how it's transformed, and how does the idea of prestige then become transformed in the light of, say, African immigrant experience in the United States. However, I've also put that alongside other fabrics, for example, adire, indigo dye fabric, which returns on Ikea fabric from South Africa, to speak to interwoven histories across the African diaspora. You see the American flag, and I think about Sonia Clark's work around deconstructing the American flag and thinking through ideas around racism and all the work that we still need to do there. Next slide. Indigo shows up, and I'll get more into the color of indigo later on here in The Road to Divinity, which also includes this fabric that you see here. It's a traditional adire, a commemorative fabric for Mama Susan Wenger, and I'll talk more about that later. However, formally speaking, what I'm doing is really adding to discourse in the context of queer feminist aesthetics, challenging homophobia. I suspect most lesbians might admit that their first true orgasm did not occur from penetration, but rather from another woman. And with this comes a sense of awareness and acceptance of the body. This work is raised above ground, inviting an upward gaze, as with the Sistine Chapel, perhaps, and thus treating religion subversively. From a political lens, queer love is often discussed alongside LGBT concerns, ranging from the AIDS crisis in America to protests around corrective rape in South Africa. Activists and artists we've used our platform to critique discriminatory laws against LGBT people, same-sex loving people, and the work continues. Less discussed, however, or displayed are positive perspectives and positive imagery of queer love. And in the case of women who love women, not necessarily a rejection of men, but rather simply acceptance of their own essential nature. Next slide. So here we see Zanele Muholi's being, which I find just incredibly heart-moving, and I apologize for the low resolution of this photo. Here I see that lesbians are lying together nude and in gentle embrace. This work has inspired me over the years to use my work as a platform for embracing my own sexuality and finding a sense of acceptance within that. Displays of warmth and intimacy in a positive light, the love between Black and African women, just very undeniable in their gesture, sharing a bond that's seemingly innocent, but very mature, in awareness. Next slide. In Mickalene Thomas's work, Feel Like Making Love, from the series Brawlin' Spitfire, the two women here are more aggressive, and the context is heightened for me in Thomas's choice of this wrestling move for a gesture, this sense of aggression with the animal print, for example, in this mixed media work. However, similar to Zanele Muholi's work, it's clearly a bond that two Black women are sharing. Next slide. I've also been inspired very much by Yinka Shonibare, British Nigerian artist who, in his Gay Victorians, has spoken to, this work being a work of solidarity with the LGBT population in Africa and beyond. Here, the figures almost appear very sisterly and reserved, in their stance and the way the gestures, where they're sitting. But through the title, Shonibare is inviting us to think further and use our imaginations to gaze more deeply beneath the surface. Next slide. Destiny's Child is made of grass brooms, and I consider this work in the series of sculptures painted Black that I described earlier. However, it's similar to The Road to Divinity in that there's this idea of the spine. And here in Destiny's Child, there's a shared spine that's actually made of a church stick, which is significant in South Africa specifically, where I made this work, in that the church stick is often used in some South African churches to, quote unquote, beat the devil out of unbelievers. So here I'm trying to treat religion subversively again. While the church stick starts out as a spine, it ends in the center as a shared phallus that both female figures or androgynous figures are then sharing. Next slide. There are other ways that I've explored the idea of a shared phallus, or just explorations of acceptance and queer erotic desire in some other works, fabric works especially. This one is entitled Celebration of Life, Mama Africa. Next slide. Ola male nude does not contain a phallus. However, it's suggestive of um, where one might put a phallus. It's actually initially inspired by my own inner, uh, I would say, exploration of my masculine energy. So I think of this sometimes as a psychic self-portrait, while again speaking to interwoven histories through the fabric and the mediums that I'm using. Ihia fabric, once again, layered upon the Senegalese Olam grain manufacturing bag. Um, what are the sort of concerns around homophobia in South Africa as well as Senegal? These were some of the questions that I was thinking about as I was making this work in South Africa. Next slide. Determination. Similarly, we're seeing this act of oral pleasure, two women giving each other oral pleasure, as with the road to divinity. The road to divinity almost becomes a leap off the canvas of these narratives that I already had begun exploring a few years ago, two-dimensionally or as relief works, are now appearing strongly as sculpture. Next slide. Once again, this idea of pleasure, and here we see it on an ANC Nelson Mandela banner produced in South Africa with palm spines from traditional African broom. This idea of dominant and submissive play, and also a blurring between, I would say, abstraction and realism. Next slide. Sex demons once again. Here I'm showing batik layered on Dutch wax fabric and layering that again with white cotton. White cotton harking to, cotton fields worked by enslaved Africans in the Americas and beyond. And here I'm just raising further questions through the combination of these fabrics about the diaspora conditions. So Dutch wax fabric and its, the ongoing debate about Africanness and the Africanness of the material has been explored by Shoni Bare extensively in his body of work. But here I'm almost showing how it's, almost presenting in this very loud voice of loud condition or environment, as if shocked and appalled by this, very natural scene that's happening in its environment, that's occupying the space, for example. And batik, again, shows up here as it does in some other works, as I will share with you. Next slide. Coat of armed robbery does not include a batik. However, it's a layering of adire and Dutch wax fabric. Gay-pape would be batik and Dutch wax fabric. And again, another combination of batik and Dutch wax fabric with baby on board. And I think in doing these, in combining these materials, I'm really having a conversation between a pre-colonial condition and a post-colonial condition, and considering questions on where do we need to go next, or are we sort of just kind of going around in circles in a way. Next slide. I've been inspired by how artist Tunde Odunlade employs batik in many of his works, while he's, definitely used the material to explore traditional Yoruba indigenous concepts and teach others, share that with the world. There's also just something very important about how he brings these reliefs to a level or a depth of complexity that almost parallels the making of the batik fabrics themselves. And I want to personally thank him for that, as well as many of the artists that I've mentioned already for their inspiration over the years. Next slide. I've investigated color as the LGBT rainbow pride flag. In this work, for example, Gele pride flag. Gele, traditionally typically worn as headdress or head wrap by Nigerian women in solidarity during familial and cultural settings, celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, etc. Here it's transformed into a monumental pride flag. Some of the pieces were purchased at Yaba Market, actually, in Nigeria, and other gele strips were passed down to me from my mother. However, by using the rainbow color in this work, what I'm doing is standing in solidarity, obviously, with LGBT people in Nigeria, but around the world, who have been criminalized or demonized based on their identity. Next slide. Similarly, by using rainbow-colored yarn in Musician 1 and Musician 2, I'm extending or adding to discourse on decolonization of these contexts and these systems that continue to demonize and criminalize LGBT people. So I've done work with color, again, the pride flag, the rainbow flag, with both texture of thread and yarn, but also with actual fabric pieces, as you saw with gili. Next slide. I've been inspired by how artist Odili Donald Odita, a dear friend and mentor, also symbolically and poetically presents color as a way to understand physical but also psychic landscapes. I'm specifically interested in how my work can become a vehicle for, say, queering color or using color to queer space as part of my overall aesthetic strategy. Next slide. Once again, indigo dye presents loudly in some previous works, Coat of Armed Robbery and My Hero Dad. And I talk about this, these two works, I'm putting them side by side here, I should say, because I recognized very repeat, or say a coming through of the patterning on the fabric. If you see on the adire, on the prestige dress, My Hero Dad, there's a pattern that is very similar to the patterning of adire in Coat of Armed Robbery. Next slide. Next slide. We'll come back to the last slide, Ali, but I wanted to jump to this slide while sticking to this idea of the patterning that we see on the adire that appears in my fabric works, is borrowing from and giving praise and honor to, you know, traditionally how it's produced by many women in Yoruba context in Nigeria. This particular image is showing adire eleko, the one on the left, I should say. And I'll just read it, shortened by the use of stencils made from the lids of tin boxes in which the British shipped their tea to Nigeria. Traditional patterns were cut out from the tin. Cassava starch was applied with a large paintbrush over the stencil, thereby rapidly applying the pattern to the cloth. With the two stencils for the alternating patterns, ostriches, ducks, chief's leaves, a narrow board along which to trace lines separating the patterns. A cloth could then be completed in 1/10 of the time than a hand-drawn cloth would take. So there was even, you know, constant innovation and constant exploration of technique and craft and honing that craft within the production of adire eleko. And I think that showing up, how that shows up in my works, My Hero Dad, for example, and Coat of Armed Robbery, I not only give light to this legacy, I'm simultaneously telling new contemporary narratives around social political identity, narratives around sexuality, narratives around nationality, etc. Next slide, or previous slide, I should say. Yes. In The Road to Divinity, the adire that shows up underneath the sculpture, underneath the floating androgynous sculptures, is this long, beautiful cloth called, it's a commemorative cloth to the life of Mama Susan Wenger, who was a late Austrian artist whose tireless efforts to preserve Ocean Sacred Grove, as well as create her own art at Ocean Sacred Grove, has lent to preserving many of the aesthetic and the richness of the space. She's a spiritual caretaker of that space. And this particular cloth was gifted to me by Robin and Hugh Campbell. Robin is shown in the photo with me on the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. Next slide. Yes. Previous slide, sorry. Here, hold it here. So I'm inspired by the recent work of Firelei Baez, which deeply explores the history of indigo in the West Indies. Can we move on to the next slide? Specifically Haiti, which is where she's from and was partly raised. She was also partly raised in Dominican Republic. But through installation, sculpture, and with color, she's done a dynamic work at ICA Boston. This is from her recent solo show entitled To Breathe Full and Free, a Declaration, a Revisioning, and a Correction. Dynamically just interrogating this often overlooked part of history, the history of racism, and inviting us to envision new possibilities around indigo and returning indigo to say, you know, the color of love as coined by Chief Nika Davis Okundaye. Now, the color of love and just indigo in particular has been, you know, well researched by, you know, authors such as Catherine McKinley and Catherine LeGrand. And, you know, the laborious energy and the laborious intense energy of the chemistry of fermentation around production of indigo dye fabric. However, when this energy moves out of a sacred space into one that's very toxic, as it did for many enslaved Africans in parts of the South, including Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, the color of love then becomes layered in discourse around violence and you know, vulnerability of the body. You know, we can almost hear Duke Ellington's song Mood Indigo when we think about the scenes that may have come out of the plantations of enslaved Africans producing indigo. You know, it basically moved from this powerful sustainer of life to rendering human life secondary to its own existence. And this is sadly, I believe, often ignored and overlooked, or even at worst praised in the context of cultural and aesthetic considerations around the history of indigo. And I'll just read a passage from Jenny Balfour Paul's book Indigo to emphasize this point. She says, at this period, when settlers from different European nations were experimenting with a range of plantation products, indigo's name frequently turns up along with other potentially viable cash crops such as ginger, sugar, wine, grapes, rice, and cotton. However, the indigo industry really got going in the 1730s, again, thanks to the availability of slaves. It combined well with rice, as slaves could be fully employed during the slack season for indigo. So human life and the body in itself is treated as almost secondary or, you know, very, I would say, almost only in reference to producing this material, which could then be exported all over the world for more than half the, or I would say, prices that one could, even the slaves themselves could not afford. Just incredible amounts of exploitation around this color, which I think has still yet to be dug into for its depth of concerns. Next slide. And so building off of that history and the painful and complex history of indigo as it concerns the African slave trade, where, as I said, the color was used to devalue and dehumanize Black and African bodies. My work is simultaneously honoring the ongoing efforts of Chief Dr. Nika Davis Okundaye in Nigeria, who who's a pioneering artist in herself. And I said she coined indigo as the color of love, which is widely believed as, a color that, has brought women together, especially in the sense of using it as a way of economically empowering groups of women in parts of Nigeria, particularly Oshogbo, where one of her workshops is located. As an artist herself, her practice runs along very strong feminist lines with use of painting, aside from indigo, and started out, I would say, as part of the Oshogbo art movement when she was formerly married to Twin 77 from the 50s and 60s, etc. Anyway, her ongoing efforts to renew and educate the world about indigo and adire specifically, and raising global awareness about the color of love is something that I feel that my work is doing, or I would say building on rather, as I'm interrogating that historical sphere. Next slide. So my practice is also continuing in this trajectory of exploring my body and exploring the body, but through photography and using my body as a medium, not just in performance, but in photography. I won't go into this, is from a series called Royal Nudes, and I won't go into it very deeply here, but I would say that my intention with this series is to add to discourse on queer African aesthetics, queer feminine aesthetics that I find inspiring in the works of artists such as Zanella Muholi, the late Rotimi Fani Kayode, Nina Chanel Abney, Lyle Ashton Harris, Andrew Esiebo, Julie Meretu, and so many other artists. But I also hope to inspire other queer Yoruba artists who are working through some of the same ideas and issues that I've been building on in my work. And they include Kehinde Awofeso, as well as Taina Adebowale in Nigeria. So just kind of pushing the boundary on how far the body can speak and how far the body itself can interrogate and really queer space. Once again, with this new level of, say, unapologetic acceptance of the body is a space that I am still investigating. And I will end with a paragraph from this book entitled African Philosophy. It's an anthology in which, part of which, the chapter by Segun Gbadegesi describes in his text Yoruba Philosophy, Individuality, Community, and the Moral Order. He states, the importance of the new arrival as a unique individual is reconciled with his or her belonging to an existing family, which not only decides his or her name, but also has a duty to see that his or her birth is a significant episode in its existence. The Yoruba say, Ile ni anwo ki ato somo loruko. We look at the family traditions before we give the names to a new baby. He further shares that each creature of Olodumare is God, is thought of as having its own beauty, Iwalewa, by fact of its existence, and that it's not to be undermined by human valuation. Iwa is the handiwork of the deity, the originator of existence, and her beauty as well as her character as expressions of her existence as an individual being. And I find this to be a very powerful quote on many levels, not just within a psychic and spiritual grounding as a queer Yoruba artist, but politically, even as a space, in a starting point even in which to interrogate those who still believe within conservative realms that being gay or being queer is quote unquote un-African and quote unquote, Western product, etc. That within indigenous Yoruba contexts there are and always have been, again, this idea of the fluid, the hybrid, the tolerance for individuality and acceptance of individuality has always been woven into our culture and our tradition, our language, even prior to colonialism And so thank you so much for joining me and listening and sharing this sacred space with me. It's been quite a journey over the last 10 years, and even putting this presentation together for you has been an incredible learning experience for myself as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that, Adejoke. I'm going to take a look at the chat and the Q&A.
You can? Okay. Sorry, we can't hear you, Ali and Nora. I don't know why that's happening. Seeing a question here from Dr. Colley about, and I guess I'll read it. Your work also appears to grapple with the question of temporality, and I wonder if you could comment on how the question of temporality intersects with queerness. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. It's a great question, and I think that we are actually in a space, and I think further heightened by the pandemic, where temporality has become increasingly significant or important. We are considering how space, time, and the psyche, how we navigate space and time in our individual domestic spaces. And I think that queerness is something that we can then, within that limitation, or some may say it's not a limitation, some may see it as the glass half full rather the glass half empty. Queerness is going to be some discourse that we can more deeply consider in the space of, I would say, neither being here or there, where we can actually be centered and grounded in the space that we are actually in, both physically and psychically, and consider how queerness actually can respond to that. I think more recently, I think the work Crown for Kamala speaks very much to this idea of temporality, and that, especially in creating the video, Crown for Kamala, space is almost, it could be a place where it's anywhere or nowhere at the same time, and really allows the mind to envision and imagine new types of psychic and physical spaces. I know I created it in New Haven. I know it was in Connecticut. I know it was by the lighthouse. But there isn't any specific environmental key that tells you where that space is. It could also be somewhere out in, gosh have you, it could be in Colorado, it could be somewhere in Africa, it could be somewhere in Europe. And so the sort of universality that comes out of also being centered and grounded in the space that you are in, I think is something that is a positive that allows one to actually go beneath the surface. And that's where queerness comes in that you're now considering what's in the body, in the psyche, and isn't dealing with superficialities, for say, and masking, removing the mask, for example. And how does your body move freely and intuitively within that type of context, within that space? Even straight people could then identify with a space within their bodies, within that is more fluid, or that is more, I would say left or right leaning on the chart, on the rainbow, on the spectrum of queerness. We like to think of it as a spectrum. You can then begin to shift in your psyche along that spectrum of queerness, and not necessarily be so hardened into one space. So I think my work speaks to that somewhat, and I hope that that answers your question.
Okay, Adejoke, I'll try one last time. Can you hear me? No, okay. Well, thank you,
I have a
everyone.
question from the audience. Which one would you say is your favorite among the ones shown here? Well, that's a trick question. I don't have any favorite work. Some artists like to say that their favorite is the one they're currently working on. And in some ways I can identify with that. I can see why, because it's the work that's currently in flow with what's happening now, what's happening in the body, and that could be very inspiring to the artist to keep going, regardless of what's happening, you know, in the exterior environment. So I'm very excited about the Road to Divinity and other smaller sculptures that are being produced in the similar aesthetic as we speak, but that does not draw away from my love from previous or past sculptures. Okay, there's another question from Kajatan in the Q&A function. Okay. All right. Can you speak a bit more about energy in your work, spiritual but also material, as in NEPA and load shedding, and the repurposing, animating in your art? Yes, I spoke a bit about energy in different ways. I spoke about energy as, you know, this duality, you know, balancing masculine and feminine energy. I also spoke about the duality of light and dark, you know, especially when I was referencing light embedded within sculptures and the performances. When I mentioned NEPA and load shedding, I think energy is something that is often taken for granted, you know, like air or water. Light energy is something that we just take for granted all the time. And so through the work, I try to draw attention to it. As you could see within Crown for Kamala, for example, it starts out the video in complete darkness and then moves very much stark contrast into light environment, right? The outdoors. And so there's this recognition that energy can shift and can move, and especially when you know, those of us who live in the West take for granted that there will always be light. You know, I would say not everywhere in the West. There are definitely parts of America that still have a lot of infrastructure issues that need to be taken care of. But I would say it's the magnitude of social and political infrastructure in parts of Africa where, you know, exactly issues like NEPA taking light in Lagos or load shedding in South Africa could happen just randomly at any time without warning, and could last several hours and sometimes days, can be very, you know, disruptive to life, and has been very disruptive to institutions and just individual lives and families. And so this is definitely, yes, there's a spiritual journey that I'm traveling in my work, but it does not take away from those political issues and political concerns that I try to bring light to, for lack of a better word.
This was an incredibly enriching presentation, and I wish Adejoke could hear us so that we can tell her how wonderful this was, but it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you to all of you for coming and attending, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. The video will be available on YouTube, and if you have any questions for Adejoke, you should go to her studio website and you can always email her.